Progressive Rugby. This is a new organisation. They have penned a letter, an open letter to Bill Beaumont, Sir Bill Beaumont, the chairman of World Rugby. They've got a list of points that they think will make the game better and safer. And a large focus of what these guys are saying is with regards to brain injuries. And that kind of reared itself towards the end of last year. That some well-known guys were having some pretty bad concussion and memory issues, some former players. So Progressive Rugby, it's got a whole bunch of guys as part of it, but the front men so far that I've seen, James Haskell and former Canadian international Jamie Cudmore. So these guys have highlighted 5 points in their open letter. They said it's not an exhaustive list, but these are some of the more urgent points that they need to tackle at World Rugby's level to make the game safer for everybody. I'll go over these points quickly. I'll put the website in the description. It's just progressiverugby.org, so you guys can have a read it yourself. But I'll kind of summarize them, and you guys can let me know your thoughts as well. The first point is reducing injury risk, and that mainly boils down to limiting the number of contact sessions the guys can have. The laws of the game being interpreted the way they were meant to, so less stuff like guys flying into rucks and more guys like binding onto rucks. Limiting the number of substitutes to make it only injury-based subs rather than tactical subs, and limiting the number of matches guys can play in a year, especially internationals. They also talk a bit about tackling technique, the high-low tackles that happen at the same time. There's some fair points there. I'm not sure how much contact training goes on at the elite level. My dad used to coach club rugby, and he said it was mostly they just did skill stuff because they didn't want to risk injuring players because they didn't have guys they could just call upon if they got too many injuries. So they didn't really do the full contact stuff during the week. But again, that's club level, so you guys might have some more insights there. The limiting substitutes thing. This is not the only people I've heard talk about that. I think that's a good move. I don't know about just for injuries only, but I've always thought fewer substitutes. Being able to substitute half the team seems like too much, that you can bring on guys fully fresh for for as long as you can. So they've been increasing the number of substitutes throughout the years, and you're seeing coaches employ it in clever ways, but it's just led to bigger bodies and more stoppages, I think, and less kind of free-flowing rugby. I think it would be safer and probably a better watch if we had slightly smaller guys who were a bit fitter. But anyway, that's just me. Limiting the number of matches, I don't think just needs to be... They've only highlighted international. I think that could be at club level, franchise level as well. Second point they talked about is prophylactic player welfare, and I had to look up prophylactic because I've only seen that word in old World War II movies where the guys are talking about condoms. They called them prophylactics, but apparently it's preventative medicine. There you go, I've learned my word for the day. I always thought I had a pretty decent vocab, but apparently not. They're talking about a career health passport for players. So I guess as your career progresses, if you get a broken leg, if you get an ACL injury, if you get concussions, that all needs to go into your player health passport, so they can kind of keep track of your injuries that you've had. And they talk about an MOT, which I had to also look up. That's like in New Zealand we would call it a warrant of fitness. So it's like a yearly check that your car has to undergo. I guess in the UK that's called the MOT. So they're essentially saying that a player needs to go through the same kind of check at the start of every year, just to check what kind of shape they're in to make sure they're good to play. They should have a concussion database at World Rugby and increased education on head injuries and concussion management. That all makes sense to keep track of guys' injuries. I would be surprised if the clubs at least aren't keeping track of the guys' injuries over time. The doctors at the teams, but maybe having something more centralized where it follows you around rather than your team keeping that information would make sense. And a concussion database is certainly something we need to be looking into, because concussion, if there was one thing that's going to kill contact sports, it's concussions. So concussion gets its own point, concussion management. They just mainly talk about keeping up with the science to make sure they're using the most relevant data, that they should be keeping the assessments going, not just at match day, but also at training. And return to play guidelines need to be longer. It needs to be 3 weeks. So rather than like whatever it is now, like 7 days, it needs to be 3 weeks. I think return to play at the moment can vary depending on if you've still got symptoms, right? Some guys can take quite a long time to come back. but they're saying it should be at least 3 weeks. And that guy, I forget his name, the NFL doctor who looked at the concussions, last year he said, like, basically from his point of view, a concussion should be a season-ending injury. It should be like doing your ACL. So, yep, 3 weeks in the scheme of things may actually be relatively short. And also comprehensive screening, as in other sports, after recurrent concussions. Now, that may lead to, like, if you saw the news, there was a French doctor that claimed Johnny Sexton had probably had like 30 concussions throughout his career, and he denied it or said it was not factual. Having some kind of register of every injury like that may actually kind of help with the management of that kind of thing. Also, review the minimum clinical experience required to be present pitch side. So making sure you got the top medical people at the side of the pitch for those concussion checks and whatnot. Post-retirement welfare, so looking after guys once they've retired. A concussion fund needs to be set up by World Rugby. They need to own the player passports, so like the injury histories, I guess they'll be compensating guys if they've had injuries from rugby. I'm just trying to read between the lines with that one. And establishing a more empathetic relationship with insurers. So just, I guess, looking after guys in their retirement once they've got their beat-up bodies, which, again, makes a lot of sense. Rather than getting sued, it would be beneficial to be looking after guys once they've finished playing and not kind of discarding them. Not saying that's what World Rugby's doing, but just saying. Access for all, they're saying each national union needs to be responsible for developing databases of medical specialists able to provide appropriate assessment and advice post-concussion. Now that may sound good on paper. Each national union, the national unions vary in terms of their resourcing and available expertise. So what's true for the RFU may not be true for, I think, of any Spanish rugby union. I don't know what kind of resources they've got. You know what I mean? If you watch the Oceans Apart documentary from Dan Leo, you would have seen they went inside the Tongan RFU and it was like a building with 2 offices. So, you know what I mean? It's probably an easy one to put on paper, but just trying to think practically. Training packages to teach safe tackling techniques for young players. That makes sense. That's a coaching thing. But these guys are saying they're basically not trying to kill the game. They're trying to make it safer. It's similar to the one we heard about with the potential lawsuits coming from guys who have had brain injuries from their rugby careers. And it's all stuff that kind of makes sense. I don't feel like World Rugby has been that slack. Maybe it's because I see rugby league here in New Zealand, which is still a relatively popular sport. And some of the stuff I see going on in rugby league, I think to myself, there's no way that would fly in rugby union. And those guys are definitely getting brain injuries. So maybe in that comparison, I look at rugby union as being relatively progressive. They had the HIAs for a while. But what these guys are saying, and I listened to Jamie Cudmore's interview when he was on New Zealand radio earlier today, or was it yesterday? He's saying that the data about concussions has been around for a very long time, since the game was amateur. So World Rugby, or the IRB, what it used to be, has been remarkably slow in their uptake. And he himself was put into situations where his health was put at risk by having to play on through concussions and whatnot. So, yeah, it's more. I don't think this concussion thing, which is largely what this seems to be about, it's not going to go away. I forgot to read out what World Rugby said. World Rugby essentially kind of acknowledged their letter and basically said, yeah, we're kind of already doing stuff. They said, welfare of the global rugby family is and always has been our priority. We take responsibility very seriously about our past, present, and future players. Ensure that players are at the heart of our discussions through international rugby. Constructive debate is always welcome. They respect opinions and suggestions that advance players' welfare. They're progressive. They're looking at the science. They're looking to evolve, and rugby is evolving with it. They're guided by the medical and scientific consensus and education. Clearly, these members, talking about these guys, love the game and want the best for it. So they're encouraged that these guys are championing a number of initiatives. So, yeah, World Rugby is basically giving them the big thumbs up without really being very committal to anything, which makes sense from an organisation. like that. They're not going to give anything concrete based on this, but it will be one to watch. Like I mentioned, with the concussions from topics from last year, and now this coming up, I don't think this is going to get smaller. I think it gets bigger, and it's probably a good thing, because I'm sure World Rugby and rugby in general could be doing better to manage these guys' brains. The last thing you want is some kind of, devastating lawsuit which just bankrupts everybody. You want to be looking after the guys and taking care of them so they don't feel the need to take a lawsuit, right? These guys have given blood, sweat, tears, and in some cases brain injuries for the game. But then again, when I did the video last time about the guys who had the brain injuries, people said, man, you knew this and you signed up for it. So, yeah, there's differing opinions on that one. But yeah, you guys let me know your thoughts. How do you reckon these guys will get along? Do you think World Rugby will come to the party? Do you see any impending changes? Do you back the idea of limited substitutions, no contact training or limited contact training, that kind of thing? And yeah, I'll talk to you again soon. See you later.